Hello and Assalamu alaikum, everyone. My name is Mariam Wasif Khan. I'm Associate Professor of Comparative Literature at LUMS. I'm joined by Luke Susi, a translator and a lecturer in classics. Luke, do you want to say a little more about your work?
My name is Luke Susi, and I work at the Department of Classics at Princeton University. I am a translator and a classicist and a poet, and what I specialize most in is translations of ancient Roman epic. So I'm very interested in mythology and reception.
Wonderful. So this is a panel about great books. It's a panel about the Western canon. And of course, the irony is that we're sitting in Lahore, a city that is very Western and at the same time very non-Western as well. But it's also a city that constantly grapples with its confusion of identities, and I think that those are things we'll talk about. But I want to do it via books and not not through kind of small talk, I suppose, Luke. Okay, so above all, this is a panel about great books. It's great books of the West. It's books that have made the West into what it is today. And it's about how these books continue to remarkably represent Western culture even today. We're going to be talking about a number of works and icons of Western culture, including the Homeric epics, the Odyssey and the Iliad. We're going to be talking about Ovid's Metamorphoses, a work that Luke has translated very recently. And we're going to be talking about Dante's Divine Comedy, Rabelais' Gargantua, Milton's Paradise Lost, among others. These are just a few names I'm throwing out there to help us imagine the structure, the big structure that we're going to be looking at in our conversation. And what I want us, Luke, you and I perhaps together, to think about is why these books are important, and perhaps why they should continue to be important as well. Because obviously, as you know, and I want you to say a little bit about this, there's a lot of movements that are against and for these books. And could you talk a little bit about how the great books canon has been appropriated by the far right and MAGA, particularly in the United States today?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's a very interesting question, and I'm glad to be tackling it here with you, and thank you all for being here. I imagine that some of you, as I was doing when Mariam was listing off that list of books, you were internally tabulating, oh, I've read that, I haven't read that, I've thought of that, I've heard of it, maybe not. And these questions of what is a great book, what makes a great book's course, and what is a classic are very live and controversial. And a couple of traditional definitions for what makes a text a classic are things like, I think, Italo Calvino said that a classic is a book that never finishes saying what it has to say. And counterpoint is Mark Twain says, it is a book that everyone wants to have read, but nobody wants to read. And so there's this sort of sense of obligation. But I think the overall idea is that there are certain works of literature that, because of what they contain and what they talk about and the way they are tonally pitched, seem to stand the test of time and speak to some kind of universal truth. That's the idea. And this whole notion of a great book's course or a series of great books really got going in the early 20th century. And the idea was that you would read this stack of books, and if you just did that, then you would be an educated person. And that was essentially the marketing pitch for Harvard Classics, which was one of the first big sets of these. And it was also known as Dr. Eliot's 5-foot shelf. And it was the president of Harvard. He says, I've curated 50 volumes for you. If you buy this, you will have all the benefits of a liberal education. And this worked very well as a marketing ploy, and hundreds of thousands of these sets were sold in America, where nobody reads. Where this becomes interesting is there's kind of an implicit totalizing factor, where it's over time tends to flip from all you need to do is read these books into these are all the books you need to read. And if you look at that list, those 50 volumes, they're great books. I think they're all worth reading. They're worth studying. You will be a more educated person if you read them. But are they complete? Well, you'll probably be unsurprised to know that this man selecting books in circa 1900, I think there's maybe 2 poems in the whole set by women, and that's about it.
Yeah, Sappho is one.
Oh, good.
Always one,
Yeah.
and then I don't even know the other woman.
Yeah, I mean, maybe
name her,
Christina Rossetti,
Yeah.
and there's nothing outside of the West except for some religious texts, some excerpts from the Quran, the Bhagavad Gita, some Buddhist scriptures, and I think the sayings of Confucius. But this idea of the great books had become so ingrained, especially in college courses, where there are in fact whole colleges in the United States still that their whole curriculum is predicated around the great books, that when people came in and decided, we should expand this, we want to make it more inclusive, you're running into the zero-sum game of the syllabus. So who are you going to knock out in order to make way for a woman or a person from outside the Western canon? And this immediately turns, of course, into a flashpoint in terms of who gets to be represented and who gets to be called the author of a great book.
Yeah, I think, Luke, that's a really great way of posing it. I mean, I'm a product of one of these great books courses, and I, again, doubly, I was formed entirely as a literary scholar. I learned to read entirely through these great books. But at the same time, when I look at them now from this particular place where we are and the place where I was from, they do, in fact, what the effect that they have is, in fact, to obscure any literary tradition from other parts of the world, to obscure ideas of humanness, to obscure ideas of magic, of belief, and I think that all that remains then is the great mythological Greece, perhaps, which is just a key word when one comes to it. And of course, what you've talked about in the United States is of course it's a key movement. But the flip side is the postcolonial side. So countries like Pakistan, at least I want to say, urban education in countries like Pakistan, India, again, all colonized sites, Nigeria, South Africa, where on the one hand, there are literary movements that reject white man's canons. So there is this great embrace of the post-colonial Anglophone. And on the other hand, there are some vestiges of colonial syllabi still remaining in public sector universities. And then there is what we were talking about a little while ago. There is, the global culture effect, what I call the global culture effect, where young people, because they're reading things like Percy Jackson or they're playing certain video games, have a sense of intimacy, perhaps, right, with this world of books without, as you said, ever having necessarily read them. So this is where we are really, and at the same time, what we're really finding ourselves at is a spot where these books are the center, and yet nobody is quite sure as to what to do with them. Mm-hmm. I think that's where we are. Okay, but Luke, let's backpedal a little, and let me just ask you, as a reader, as as somebody who does secretly or unsecretly love great books. Why great books? What makes us keep going back to this ancient set of works by white men? Or dead white men, rather.
I mean, it's not because of that, right? It is, I like the way you framed it, with these works, for better or for worse, have become integral to the infrastructure of the global intellectual culture in a way that absolutely, includes many of the major Urdu authors, right? I mean, this is, Iqbal famously is writing in response to Goethe and Nietzsche, and Monto is translating Chekhov and is writing short stories that are clearly influenced by Chekhov. If you close your eyes to this, you're really missing. You're going to end up missing parts of things that you probably don't want to be closing your eyes to. Hopefully there is something between taking on board. I mean, I understand these texts reach South Asia as artifacts and extensions of an imperialist project, right?
Yeah.
And so that's important to keep in mind, but I think one way to really frame the postcolonial question is these works have been imposed much more than they were intentionally imported, which is a difference from the United States. And what do you do with an inheritance that you did not ask for, but which you now possess? And I think postcolonial readings can often give you an opportunity to, without rejecting texts, reclaim interpretive authority.
Yeah, I think, Luke, that's a wonderful way of putting it, and particularly in this in this day and age when I think we're losing languages at a really rapid rate. I don't know. I mean, I know it's true in the U.S. also. I saw how Princeton had reduced the requirements for the classics major. If you didn't read Greek or Latin, you could do another version of the classics major, and that's and I think there was a huge outcry about that. But yeah, we have a loss of languages. We're accessing everything pretty much in translation in English. So there's a double whammy of imperialism here. On the one hand, these are translations in English, and on the other hand, they represent really the core of European thought. And let me just start with something as simple as the Odyssey, where Odysseus is a man of twists and turns who's learned many cities, and who has looted from other cities, etc. And one of the things when I ask my class to kind of read not just Odysseus as a man, at close read the opening passage of the Odyssey, but also to look at the map, the big map that prefaces every Odyssey, a copy which has which is Odysseus leaving from Troy, which is now in Turkey, and he's traveling towards Ithaca. But I always ask them, where else do you see this map? Why is this map in the news every day? And nobody's actually able to answer that it's in the news every day, because this is the map, or this is the ocean where thousands of migrants actually drown, on a monthly basis, quite literally. So in a sense, the text, the space, all of it is extremely contemporary as well. And Odysseus, in some sense, also marks perhaps the most ubiquitous figure of our post-colonial times, right? Which is the migrant, which is the migrant who is going literally, quite literally, enduring many of the trials that Odysseus does in fact endure. So exactly, and I think that's really where we have to think about post-colonial reading. So do you want to talk a little bit about another work, perhaps? I think Metamorphosis is one.
I'm actually going to turn. I'd love to talk about the Metamorphoses, but since you brought up that point, since you brought up the Odyssey, a couple thoughts about that in the refugee experience. Yeah. There's a couple different ways you can go about a post-colonial reading or post-colonial reinterpretation. Since you brought up the Odyssey and the map, someone who looked at that map and thought, okay, someone going around all these islands and having that experience. Another part of the world where the map looks kind of similar is the Caribbean. And this was Nobel laureate Derek Walcott, and he wrote a poem called Omeros, which is an epic poem, and it's his loose retelling of the Odyssey. And it's, not based in scholarship, but it doesn't have to be, kind of by assertion. He says, I'm going to claim this. I'm going to make it my own, and I'm going to make it about my people. And that's okay because it works. It works for storytelling, and it makes a wonderful poem. But you can also do this, as you were just mentioning with the Odyssey, by refracting it back into the past. And so there is a poem which, the way it is traditionally read, it is about a hero who has been, tasked with a real manifest destiny, and he is going to go to someone else's land, and he's going to invade it, and he's going to kill all the indigenous people and create the civilization which is going to take over the world. This is also the story of someone who had foreigners come to his hometown, which was in the barbarian East. The Greeks came and burned down his city, and he's escaping with a group of refugees, and he goes to a new place and is trying to find land, and the people there refuse to take him in. They spit on him. They make fun of his oriental mannerisms. And these are both the Aeneid.
Yeah.
And they are both perfectly accurate descriptions of the Aeneid, but for a very long time, which do you think the British and German scholars who, were represented all of classical scholarship, at the beginning of the 20th century, which one were they alive to and which one were they not paying attention to at all? These are very old texts and they have a lot of meanings, and they were imbued with a lot of meanings because often they come to us just as artifacts dispatched from some unfathomable foreign world, which is antiquity, and it all gets flattened because it's presented as this is part of an imperial project. Virgil and the people of his generation lived through horrible civil wars and imperial strife and a I think pretty comparable process of having your world taken over by power-hungry imperialist tyrants. And once you go looking for the evidence once you go looking for handholds for this kind of reading, they really show up.
Yeah, I think that's an incredible and linking, of course, of these texts to each other, but also of how vulnerable some of these texts really are, right? And how much they continue to offer themselves up for humanistic readings that actually do not necessarily allow the human to only be that Kantian idea, perhaps, of the human that I think came to define Enlightenment thinking, and then, of course, informed imperialism in ways that we're still grappling with. So Luke, let's get back a little bit to the metamorphosis, and then I'm going to throw up a few other examples that we can talk about. So, can you talk a little bit about Ovid as I'm mentioning the metamorphosis because I know that many young people get it through mythology, right? Through what they call mythology. I don't think anybody really thinks about the manifestations and the violence that defines that book, and also, of course, Ovid himself has this complex, tough to kind of get hold of figure. So yeah, just and of course then your translation as well, of course. Yeah.
Thank you. That could be a very long lecture, so I will try to condense it down. It's kind of a weird thing that has happened in modern reception that most of what we refer to as Greek mythology actually comes out of this single Roman poet named Ovid, through several of his poems, but most famously his big epic, The Metamorphoses, which is this anthology, this compendium in poetry of various Greek myths. And in many cases, the version of the myth that has become standard, that has become set, is what he came up with in that poem. This is especially interesting because his versions are not faithful. They are crazy retellings, entirely in line with his personal agenda, the themes in which he is most interested. And so this person and this poem, who is kind of the source for so much of European Western culture, is also the source for this spirit of how to retell something and make it your own. What were the themes he was most interested in? He was extremely concerned with the abuse of power. And so many of his stories are about kings and gods abusing people horribly. And to give you one concrete example, do we know the story of Medusa, the lady with the snake hair, and when she looked at you, you turned to stone? Yeah. In every version of the story prior to Ovid, she had always been a monster. She was born a monster. That's what makes sense. She has monster sisters. That's entirely coherent within the mythos. He makes up this whole backstory for her, which is the whole reason that she ended up that way, is because the god Neptune had raped her in the temple of Minerva, and Minerva punished her by turning her into that. And so suddenly she is a human, and she's given the sympathetic backstory of just having her life completely ruined by two different all-powerful beings. And once you learn this, which is only after she's been killed, you have the whole story of Perseus prior to hearing her backstory, it causes you to entirely flip your understanding of who is the hero and who is the monster. And he's doing things like that all the time.
Yeah, I think that's an amazing example. And of course, I think there are so many others. for me, the Metamorphosis is actually always a difficult read, precisely because of the violence of that women endure in that work. But Luke, tell us a little bit about how you translated it. What made you translate it again?
Yeah.
And how you went about it.
Well, I'm going to use what you just said as a jumping off point, partially because of his interest in the abuse of power. He is also, by far, I would say, the Roman poet who is most interested in women. Women play very large characters in all of his stories, and they get a lot of speaking time. You actually get inside of their heads.
Yeah.
This is not to say he's some kind of modern proto-feminist, but it does tell you that prior to the advent of modern feminism, the sort of people who were studying these kinds of texts and were translating these kinds of texts are not going to be paying attention. They are not going to be prioritizing that. That is not going to be foregrounded in their work. And so that was a huge part of what I was trying to do. And to be clear, this isn't me reading something into the text. This isn't me coming in with my priority. This is me saying, I think this is in the text and has always been there, and that's what I want to draw attention to because I think other people have suppressed it. I'm not saying you can't do a retelling. I think that's a wonderful thing to do, but I'm working in an academic department. I'm trying to be fairly beholden to the text in a certain kind of way. And it's not just women and violence towards women. Ovid is the most capacious in his understandings of what different human identities can look like. And it's called the Metamorphoses because it's story after story of people getting transformed in one way or another. Birds are transformed into humans. Humans are transformed into birds. Do they still have the same soul? Do they still have the same thoughts? What does it mean to be human?
That's quite incredible. And I think that's precisely Ovid, you're right, lends himself across time and across space, I think, and that's something I want to talk about. What does it mean to read the Western canon outside of the North American Academy? So, I mean, let me bolster this question a little bit by, again, thinking about my own past as both a student in the Western Academy. I entered Princeton and immediately began this Great Books course that, as I'm very open about it, changed my life and brought me to comparative literature. I would never, ever have, come to the field without the support and I think the kind of the place I got to with these great books. And many years later, again, I didn't end up actually working on them in a scholarly fashion after my sophomore year. But when I came back to Lahore, the first thing I was told, in fact, I was hired on the condition that I could teach a Great Books course at LAMS, which I did in fact start doing, and it became central to I think the literary journeys of many students. But I also continued to feel hypocritical when I did this, when I taught this course, precisely because on the one hand, we were unable to kind of, I as a resource was not doing what I was hired and what I specialized in doing, which is 19th century Urdu, and of course methods in literature, but I was also doing what I loved. I'm also love that stuff, but I really do love the Western canon in ways that I always find inexplicable at some point. But eventually, and for me, a turning point in my teaching was 2014 when the APS attack happened. And the APS attack, Luke, just for context, is this really terrible shooting of around at least 200 to 300 children in Peshawar by Taliban fighters on December 14th. And that actually changed the way I read, or I was able to read about violence in Lahore. And it just so happened that I had finished teaching the Iliad right then. And right around the same time, Muhammad Hanif, who's also here at this festival, had written this incredible piece about what do we do when violence like this is staring us at the face. He talked about, sitting in the newsroom and kind of getting numbers of how many children are dead. And parallel to that, I was reading this passage the Iliad, which was where the narrator, and very rarely in the Odyssey and Iliad do you see a narrator actually come out, right? And this narrator saying, "I can't deal." I mean, I've forgotten the lines now, but how can I count them all, right? That's really what the narrator kept saying. And so for me, that was an incredibly transformative moment in how do I read these texts. And really, so the Iliad for me then became a text about the task of narrating violence rather than a text about big armies or fighting each other and these great men who are in battle with one another. And from then on, my goal really has been to teach the Iliad in that fashion. Same with and again the other author who became critical again in Pakistan is Sappho, precisely because here we have a woman who's able to talk about sex in a place where women can't really talk about sex. So these are the two authors who really kind of helped me reframe how to read in the postcolonial site. I want you to talk a little bit about America, not again, and as a postcolonial site, right? As a place where at present, migrants are being put in busloads and deported, people are being imprisoned, books are being censored, university professors are being fired. Could you just talk a little bit now? Yeah.
Well, that's fairly miserable, and thank you for sharing that. I mean, that's a beautiful story. I'll try to do a roundabout way and back into the answer to your question. But earlier we talked about one of the definitions of a great book, of a classic, as being something that never finishes saying what it has to say. And what that's doing is kind of inviting you to view it divorced from context. If it's going to be universal, then it's supposedly speaking to you where you are now. At the same time, these books also do have cultural context. They were written in a specific time, in a specific country, for a specific audience. And often reading, especially very old books, is a constant play between recognizing yourself in something and finding something completely bafflingly strange. Most obviously with experiences like war and love, which can be so universal in their cruelty and heroism, I mean, in the case of war, and love and delight and misery in the case of love, but also in terms of courtship and actual battle tactics and such. So culturally specific. I don't think I don't have quite as dramatic of a life story as you do, but I grow up as an ethnic minority in the United States in a house with a set of the Britannica great books of the Western world. And again, I mean, these are texts that, because of an imperialist project and a series of imperialist projects, have been really closely identified with some kind of Western Anglo-American enterprise. Ovid's Metamorphoses and, Homer's Iliad, these were not written in England and America either. And I think for the purposes of interpretation, it's really important to understand we are not here discussing them and telling you that they're worth studying and reading because they are sacred texts or because Western literature is superior, but because it is important to take on board that it should be at least as interesting to know what these poems read like in Lahore as they do in Cambridge or Cambridge, Massachusetts. The people in this room, we have every bit as much right to interpret and to contest and to retransform these works. I did not answer your question about what's going on in America.
Okay. Yeah, I think nobody wants to talk about what's going on in America, especially if you are going back there. But let me let's kind of circle around a little bit. This is a moment where, and let's take the A word out. This is a moment where there is this kind of backlash against great books, against this particular set of works, precisely because it represents a kind of a dead white tradition that ostensibly was racist, genocidal, among others, and it is pitted against what is a kind of a post-colonial movement, which is include voices from other parts of the world. And the problem is that there doesn't seem to be a conversation between the two, right? That seems to be the big issue, where it's either this or that, right? Either this defines literary studies or this defines literary studies. And the entire crisis really seems to be what do we do in the middle, or what can we do? So do you want to talk a little bit about how does one get around this, really?
Well, I was kind of hoping to ask you that in terms of what you're doing in your classroom, but
I can answer that eventually.
Yeah, we can do that next. So, under attack, as with so many kind of legacy institutions, the way things used to work, things like the great books can. You'll be unsurprised to hear there's a lot of polarization going on in the world, right? And it can be simultaneously under attack from both sides. And on the one hand, there's a conservative, we should be reading only dead white men people. And I think what's important to remember is how prescriptive their understanding of these texts are. They really are trying to uphold some kind of patriarchal and paternalistic and, frankly, patronizing idea of what these books are for. And that was the idea of the Harvard Classics, right? It's like I, the Harvard professor, am telling you, this middle-class person who's trying to make something out of yourself, to go make something of yourself by reading these books. Everything that we've talked about in terms of what is the value, what is the reward of reading these books, is the opposite of that. It's about reading them in new ways and trying to dredge up new meanings that previous people with different cultural viewpoints overlooked because they were living in different times. We're saying that they have value because you can continue to find value in them. And so how do I get around this? I think it's extremely meaningful to read a text. I'm just going to be repeating myself, but read a text that many people have read before, but be able to identify, for instance, in Ovid or in a lot of Roman literature, there's a lot of representations of gender nonconformity, which nobody was paying attention to before because no one was looking for it. And it's not that it isn't there, it absolutely is.
But what happens when somebody like Donna Zuckerberg then goes and brands Ovid as this kind of leader of what was the male movement?
The red pills.
The red pill movement. Yeah. Exactly. What happens then?
I mean, that's where we come in. Because what's happening is, because so much scholarship already exists, people have been reading these books for a very long time, and in my opinion, misreading them. If we aren't around to try to correct that, that means we are seeding the ground. This ground that we've been portraying as so crucial to the global intellectual atmosphere, we're just giving that away to these horrifying chauvinists and white supremacists. And so it is important that we give this corrective again, because I think what so many people, what Donna Zuckerberg was specifically alluding to, is because there's so many portrayals of sexual violence in Ovid, and so many of the earlier translations were very callous about that. I can be more specific if you want to.
Please do.
Okay. For instance, there is... There are moments where rapes are clearly happening in the Latin, and they are not clearly happening in English translations. And the things translators would do to just completely overlook it. At one point, there's a woman who is raped, and later on, she says to her father specifically, I didn't consent. He forced himself upon me. And one translation, which is one of the most popular ones currently on the market, the translator inserts a line before her saying that to her father, which says, in her own explanation of events.
Oh, God.
I mean, there's nothing in the original text that does that. This is rape culture in a nutshell. This is, you are bending over backwards to try to delegitimize the viewpoint of the woman in that story. That's what's going on. And so I think that's what Donna Zuckerberg is responding to. And my response to that is, let's go back to the text and see what's actually there.
No, let's go back to the translator. Actually, I mean, I'm going to come back in a bit to my own kind of not interventions, but my own negotiations. But one of the things we're seeing is this host of new translations, particularly by women, Emily Wilson among them, who for whom, again, who are bringing these texts back, perhaps from the viewpoints of women, perhaps in ways that complicate the text. Particularly, again, she's done those epics, so the Homeric epics. So any do you want to talk a little bit about the interventions of female translators in the field?
No, I'm very happy to do that. I did an event with Emily Wilson actually on Monday, so we were very recently talking about this, and it's actually quite similar to what you see happening with early highly orientalized translations of like Arabic and Persian literature, in that people come in with these stereotypes. And that's your understanding of the text, and you see in it what you want to see, or even worse, you don't like you don't like the text that you're translating, and you want to make it better, and so you massage it to conform to your worldview. And so there were all these. In what Emily Wilson was reacting to is these descriptions of women, that were, the typical male author stuff, bouncy breasts and, slender hips and all that sort of thing. And she was reading the Homeric Greek, and sometimes there would be words that had never been translated this way, but actually meant, like, the woman was described as having thick hands. And no previous translator had written that because, like, she needs to be some, graceful ideal of feminine beauty. She shouldn't be like that.
She needs to look like the paintings, actually. Yeah.
And so I compare it to older Orientalist translations because it's the same. By subtle gradations in word choice, you can make a much more essentialized reading of the text that is like really hitting all the same points, but from a different angle.
Yeah. Could you tell everybody a little bit about what Emily Wilson has done that's different and that has really changed, the ways in which we can read the Iliad and the Odyssey, which otherwise are these heavily masculine. Really, the Iliad just reeks of testosterone. So,
I think it's actually very similar to what I was talking about before, which is you revisit the text and you have an eye out for these things for these aspects, including portrayals of women that previous translators have really been sanding out of existence, and you make sure that you're not doing that, and you go against the grain whenever you get a chance to. And I don't think this is what you're going for, but because I just was talking to her about this. One strategy that she and I have both come up with for doing this is we actually use very conservative poetic forms. It's this idea of trying to be, the line I like to use is conservative in our approach to the poetry, but not in our attitude towards its content. And I think one of the effects of that is to signal to the reader, this is not some newfangled thing that we're coming up with. It's not because we are modern people and we think in order to make it accessible to you, it has to be super modernized, and also we're going to put all of our woke politics in there. It's really that this stuff has always been there. It is authentic to the text, and if it seems new to you, that is because of a history of suppression and censorship and vandalism.
Yeah, I think what these translations have actually done is create a fuller humanity within these texts, which previously, what you saw was, these uber humans and then these minor humans. But I think that one of the things that these texts, these newer translations have done, particularly Emily Wilson's, I've not seen Daniel Mendelssohn's as closely yet, but I do know he has this really intimate relationship with the Odyssey, so I really am looking forward to reading his translation as well. But I think that what you see, particularly in the Wilson translations, is that the human is all humans, all the humans that make up the world of these epics, and all the humans who feature alongside these heroes are now fleshed out as complex beings, each one with their own personhood and their own stories. I think that's what's really important about these translations. So we have around 5 more minutes, I think, to talk before we can open up for questions. But I'll answer your question now, Luke. So I've done various things. I think the great thing about playing with these books, and I'm going to use the phrase playing with them in Lahore, is that freedom and that flexibility is finally there. So doing this in a place like Princeton, you have to play by the rules. You cannot go and say, I'm from a place that is not this place. And I mean, I distinctly recall in my Great Books course that there was this one class dedicated to the Quran, and, it was just like, it was, nicely kind of made fun of by a number of students who were fluent in Latin, Greek, and didn't know Arabic, but I think here it's the opposite. You can't touch the Quran. So whenever we talk about religious poetics or the histories of the Abrahamic religions, we're able to read the Bible in this incredibly literary fashion in Lahore. And one of my favorite kind of events from, there's many favorite events from both the Hebrew Bible and the Christian Bible, but what always stands out to me is how desperately the Bible begins to stand in for anxieties about religion and doubt that young people in this country face, and that the Bible becomes the site through which young people are able to negotiate events from the Quran that they're obviously not able to talk about in a place like this. You wanted to say something, Luke?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a wonderful way of putting it, and it probably sounded kind of airy and squishy when I allude to something like the global intellectual infrastructure. But what we're talking about is these are stories that are so widely known in many cases that they can be played upon and stood on their head, and they have strong enough bones and people have a strong enough understanding of them that you can use them to access things that you feel, for whatever reason, you are unable to say. And since you mentioned in your list of things we might talk about earlier, the Divine Comedy,
yes,
I want to talk about one example with an extremely adventurous translation choice. I don't know if you've read the Divine Comedy, Dante's Inferno, and the two other parts, but basically it's the year is 1300, and this Italian poet named Dante is walking through hell, and then later he's walking through heaven, and the whole time he's running into minor Italian political figures that you do not know and have not heard of, and it's extremely difficult to understand. You're constantly flipping back to the footnotes. Okay, who was this guy, and what was he? Did he believe in the Pope?
And they're all real.
and they're all real, and this can be a great way to learn about 1300s Italian politics, but it is really difficult for us to access. There was a translation about 12 years ago in America by a poet named Mary Jo Bang, and what she did is she switched out all the political figures. So instead, now you were in hell, and who's there but Donald Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense, who started the war on terror and that sort of thing. And of course, that dates very quickly. I mean, people are already forgetting who Donald Rumsfeld was, but guess what? All those political figures in the Divine Comedy did too.
Yeah.
But you understand immediately in a way that, or at least I did in a way that I hadn't thought about before, what a crazy dangerous thing he was doing by putting all these live political figures, who had living relatives, and people were still heavily invested in these things, and it makes this work much more alive for me. And you understand, Dante lived most of the rest of his life in exile.
Yeah. So, as did Ovid, for doing what he did. Okay, I think we have around 5 minutes left, so I'm going to open the floor for questions, which I believe we are supposed to have. Though nobody told me one is supposed to have questions, in which case we can go on talking. Are there any questions from the audience? Oh, there's a question. Great. From a great writer about great books, actually.
Okay.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes.
Hi. Thank you so much for the wonderful talk. My name's Zara. I was previously a student of Dr. Maryam Asif in the Great Books course, actually. And I'm wondering, how did you manage to strike the balance when you were reading the classics versus when you were trying to reinterpret them? Because one struggle that I had was when I go into a classical thinker, a classical philosopher, I'll just give a random example, Adorno, for instance. It's really easy to get sucked into their worldview and their framing, and trained in a traditional institution. How did you find the skill set or like the way to pave yourself out of that? That's what I'm curious about.
So how would you read, I'm going to ask you, Luke, how would you read somebody like Adorno, Theodor Adorno, both in his context but also use Adorno's ideas, right? Without kind of imposing them onto another situation. I think that's one way of putting the same question. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm afraid part of the answer is just that I happen to be a very headstrong person. And this is maybe a bit too historicizing of an answer, but I think it's often extremely clarifying when reading theorists to figure out what was going on in their lives.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah.
A, when they were 20, and
Yes.
B, when they wrote it.
Yes.
They often, Adorno especially, tends to write in these, just hugely universalizing tones about events that I think are mostly very specific.
Very specific, exactly. And events and things that he saw that were, I mean, his whole, I think his idea of Los Angeles is it's so specific. And at the same time, you're just like, dude, what do I do with this?
Yes.
That's really it. So I think, go ahead, Luke. Sorry.
Yeah, maybe I'm misunderstanding. I think I understood your question, took your question a little differently. How, speaking as an academic, how much am I reinterpreting and how much am I trying to be beholden to a text? And I think it really depends on what kind of project you're trying to create. And there isn't a correct answer. I'm working often on like a semi-academic level, and so I'm trying to be fairly close to the text while still being literary in my translations, but my translations always come with 200 pages of extremely sarcastic footnotes. And so whatever thoughts I'm having and interpretations that it's very important to me that the reader take on board, I'm able to produce that way. If I were a playwright, I would have very different answers. And I have done some translation for the stage, and there you're not passing out footnotes for people. And so a lot more of that is coming into the text. And striking a balance, I mean, it's not a problem to reinterpret. It's a wonderful thing.
Yeah, I think that really sums it up. Are there any more questions from the audience? We can take maybe one more question. Oh, there's...
Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.
Hi. My question is this, a very simple question to ask, that when we apply or see things from a post-colonial lens, especially the classics, do we challenge the authority and the universality that is attached to the classics one way or the other? What's your take on this?
Luke, do you want to go first?
I might respond. I might think some more and say after that.
Okay, let me actually let me start by saying that I really don't love the word post-colonial. Secretly, I hate it. But I also actually don't deal in things that are called post-colonial theory. But I do work as a subject in the late colony, right? If we consider colonialism as an extended condition and ourselves as subjects subjects formed within this condition, that's really the way to think about the term. That's how I think about the term. So I think one of the things that, again, there are, and because imperialism and the effects of imperialism are so extended, I think that the subjecthood or the condition of subjecthood is also one that's been, that is dynamic, right? So there were generations who continued to abide by, until very recently, right, abide by, revere, and see the colonial ideas, but also, of course, all of these texts, certain ways of reading, textuality through exactly these eyes, right? Through the fact that these texts cannot be, in fact, that they are sacred, right? That this is a sacred tradition that has been given to us, and that without this, we cannot be fully developed humans. And in fact, I think there's this lovely line by Gayatri Spivak that the subject or the post-colonial subject looks longingly towards the green forests of England or something like that, right? And and again, the dust suddenly, this place doesn't have any green for some reason. So I think that's really the way to start. But I think that as subjecthood itself alters, right? And because this is you're not a fixed condition. This is not a fixed condition. The ability to read and the ability to to really challenge is also something that that changes alongside, right? So, in many ways, the readers that I taught 10 years ago are not the readers that I'm teaching now, and there is something incredible about that knowledge, right? So the condition is still there, right? The condition of being colonized, of being cultured within this culture is absolutely there. How you negotiate belonging, I think that's something that's dynamic and that has changed, and I think that also challenges the very idea of post-coloniality in that sense. Yeah.
I like what you said about challenging universality. I think that's absolutely something you should be doing, because particularly if we were talking about the old, original, great books syllabus, that is something that someone a long time ago in a very different place with a very different worldview decided based on his own beliefs was universal. Universality is a question of identification. That's not a quality that inheres in a text or any work of art. That's a connection that is or is not made every time you, as a reader, open the book. And as I said, I do think there are universal qualities to these books because they deal with themes that I think have always been part of the human experience. At the same time, they are specific to various cultures, and you can read them for either purpose. I mean, you could read it to learn more about, ancient China or ancient Rome. And I think what I just always try to challenge people to do, whether, as a post-colonial enterprise or, just because you're reading, if you come across something that seems impossibly foreign and beyond your experience, try to hold it up and examine it from a few different angles and see if that's really true. And if something seems, this is exactly my experience, the Romans are just like me, that's also something I'm thinking, are they really? Take a closer look at that. And so I think whatever you're feeling, you should question it.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it. That allows you to really continue a negotiation rather than tacit acceptance. I think that's how I'd put it. Okay, I think are we out of time? Okay, we're out of time. Thank you so much, Luke. That was a really fun conversation. All right,
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.